My mother used to say that some things aren't planned, they're just permitted to happen. I didn't understand what she meant until I was old enough to ask about how she met my father. And even then, she never gave me the whole answer at once. She grew up in a Hutterite colony in the prairie country, where meals were taken together in a long hall and nothing belonged to just one family. My father was raised Amish, on land his grandfather had cleared himself, where a man's worth was measured by what he built with his own 2 hands on his own patch of ground. 2 ways of living that rarely crossed paths, let alone found reason to. They met because of a harvest. The colony had more hands than acres one autumn, and a neighboring bishop arranged for some of the Amish men to help bring in wheat in exchange for shared equipment. My father was one of the young men sent over. My mother was the one who brought water out to the fields each afternoon. She told me once, carefully, the way people talk about things they've turned over in their minds for years, that she noticed him because he didn't talk much, but he noticed everything. He noticed when the youngest boy in the crew was struggling to keep pace and quietly took the heavier end of the load without saying a word about it. Neither family called it courtship, not at first. It was letters, mostly, then visits that were explained as business. By the time anyone said it plainly, both communities had already begun to brace themselves. Her people worried she'd be giving up the shared life she'd known for something too solitary. He was worried he was marrying someone who didn't understand what it meant to answer only to your own household, your own land, your own bishop. They married anyway, in a small ceremony that neither community fully claimed as its own. My mother's colony sent a gift, and a letter that read more like a blessing spoken through gritted teeth. My father's community came, but stood a little apart at the edges, the way people do when they've decided to be present without deciding to approve. I wasn't born yet, but looking back now, I think that quiet distance at the wedding was already telling us something about what was coming. I grew up on my father's land, in a small farmhouse with a wood stove and a garden my mother tended like it was the one piece of the colony she'd carried with her. We went to Sunday worship at the Amish church, and twice a year we made the long drive to the colony for visits that felt like stepping into another life entirely. At home, I wore what the other Amish children wore. Plain dresses my mother sewed herself, a covering pin just so, because that was what was expected on my father's land. But she never quite let go of certain habits from her own upbringing. She hummed hymns in a cadence the colony used, different from the way our congregation sang them, slower, rounder somehow. I didn't know it was different until I sang it that way once at a gathering and a woman beside me gave me a look I didn't understand yet. At the colony, it was the opposite. My cousins there dressed in colony style, and for those visits my mother would bring along clothes that matched, so I wouldn't stand out too much. But I always did, a little. I didn't know the mealtime rhythms by instinct the way they did, when to speak, when to wait, how the communal kitchen worked without anyone needing to explain it. I watched before I moved, the way a visitor does, even though these were supposed to be my people too. There was a particular phrase my mother used at home, one from her own childhood, that meant something like settled enough, a small thing she said when supper was ready or when a chore was finished properly. I used it once at the colony, without thinking, the way children repeat things. My aunt smiled at first, then said, gently, "That's a strange way for an Amish girl to talk." I remember that sentence more than almost anything else from those years. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't. It was said kindly, even fondly, but it was the first time I understood that I carried something in me that didn't belong fully to either side. I was too colony for the farmstead and too farmstead for the colony, and no one meant it as an insult, but I felt it as one anyway. I didn't ask my mother about it. I just remember deciding, quietly, to be more careful about which parts of myself I let show, depending on whose kitchen I was standing in. By the time I was 11 or 12, I had stopped being surprised by the small ways I didn't fit. What changed was noticing that it wasn't random. It had a shape to it. At the Amish school, the other children were kind enough, but there were certain conversations that closed when I came near, talk of which families were being considered for which responsibilities within the church, who might be asked to host instruction, whose daughters were being watched as good marriage prospects for certain sons. I was never part of those conversations, not because anyone disliked me, but because everyone understood, without needing to say it, that my mother's blood made my place in that ledger uncertain. I asked my father once why I wasn't included in the girls chosen to prepare the communion bread that year, a small honor given to certain families in rotation. He was quiet a moment before he said that it wasn't a matter of favor, it was a matter of order, and that our family's order was harder to place than most. He said it gently. It still landed hard. At the colony, it worked in reverse but felt the same. There was a girl my age, a second cousin, who was being prepared that year for baptism instruction alongside several others her age. I asked my aunt, carefully, if I might join, since I would be visiting long enough that summer. She didn't say no outright. She said it would need to be discussed with the elders, since my standing wasn't the same as a girl raised entirely within the colony. Discussed. I understood that word to mean it wouldn't happen. I began to notice, once I was looking for it, that this wasn't one or two incidents. It was a pattern stitched into how each community decided who belonged fully and who belonged partly. I was partly Amish. I was partly colony. And partly, I was learning, meant not really, in the ways that mattered most. My mother saw it too, even though she rarely spoke of it directly. One evening, clearing supper, she said, almost to herself, that she hoped I wouldn't have to choose someday between being fully one thing or nothing at all. I didn't understand then how close that day already was. Not long after, my father came home from a meeting with the ministers looking older than he had that morning. He sat at the table a long while before he told my mother, in a voice pitched low enough that I wasn't meant to hear all of it, that a decision was coming. Something about my place, my future baptism, which community I would ultimately be raised to belong to, fully, formally, for good. I lay awake that night wondering what it would cost me to be asked to choose, and what it would cost me more to actually have to answer. The meeting my father had been dreading came to our house instead of the other way around, which told me before anyone said a word that this was more serious than I'd let myself believe. 2 ministers from our Amish church sat at our table one evening, along with my father. My mother was asked to stay in the kitchen, not the front room, which was its own kind of message. I was allowed to sit at the edge of things because they said the matter concerned me directly. They spoke plainly. I was of an age now where instruction toward baptism needed to begin, if I intended to be raised into the church fully. But there was a complication they wanted settled before that could happen. Word had reached them, they said, that my mother's colony still considered me, in some sense, a child who belonged there too, and that this needed to be resolved. A person could not be raised toward 2 different orders of faith. It would have to be one. My father tried to explain that this had never been a competition, that my mother had never asked the colony to claim me formally. One of the ministers, older, said something then that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my parents' marriage. He said that this uncertainty was exactly what the church had warned my father about, years ago, before the wedding, that a marriage between an Amish man and a Hutterite woman carried a divided household. He said it was like an old wound being reopened rather than a new complaint. I hadn't known there had been a warning. I hadn't known my father had been told, plainly, what marrying my mother might cost him, and had chosen her anyway, knowing it might someday land on me. My mother, sitting just beyond the doorway where I could still see her, was very still. I understood, watching her, that she had likely known about this warning the entire time and had carried it quietly for years, hoping it would never come due. The ministers asked, gently but directly, that a decision be made, that I be brought fully into instruction here, and that my visits to the colony, at least for a time, be set aside until my place in the church was settled. It was framed as guidance, not a command. But everyone at that table understood it as something closer to an ultimatum. I was asked, directly, what I wanted. Not that evening. They gave me time. But I remember the particular silence that followed the question, my father's eyes on the table, my mother's stillness in the doorway, and the terrible, quiet understanding that whatever I said next would decide not just where I belonged, but perhaps whether my mother's whole family would ever be spoken of in this house again. I did not answer that night. I took the time they gave me and used almost all of it. Weeks passed where I did my chores, sat through worship, and said very little to anyone, turning the question over the way you turn over a stone looking for the dry side. What I found, sitting with it, wasn't an answer about which community was right. It was a question underneath the question. I had spent years believing belonging meant being fully claimed by one side or the other, the way a field belongs to whoever's name is on the deed. But the more I sat with it, the less that felt true. My mother had never stopped being Hutterite in her bones, not really, even after years of living Amish. And she was still, in every way that mattered, a good and faithful wife and mother in my father's house. She had not become nothing by becoming something else too. I began to wonder if the ministers were asking me to solve a problem that didn't actually need solving the way they thought it did. I didn't tell my father this all at once. I told him slowly, over several evenings, the way you test whether ice will hold your weight. I told him I wanted to be baptized into the Amish church, because it was the life I had been raised in and the one I understood best. But I also told him, as gently as I could, that I would not agree to give up my mother's family, that visits to the colony were not something I was willing to set aside forever, regardless of what the ministers preferred. I expected anger, or at least a long silence. Instead, my father sat with it a long moment, then said quietly that he had hoped, all along, that I might find a way to say exactly that. He said he had never wanted to choose between loving my mother and satisfying the church, and he wasn't going to ask that of me either. It wasn't resolved yet, not with the ministers, not with the colony's elders. But for the first time in a long while, I fell asleep without the tight, closed feeling of a door shutting somewhere far off in my future. My baptism happened that spring, in the Amish church I had grown up attending, and I meant every word of the vows I made that day. But I had asked for one thing beforehand, something unusual enough that the ministers took a full meeting to decide on it. I asked that my mother's family be permitted to attend. They came. Not all of them, and not without some hesitation I could feel even from a distance, but my aunt came, the same aunt who years before had gently told me my speech was strange for an Amish girl. She sat near the back, in her colony dress, among a congregation that didn't share her ways, and she stayed for the meal afterward, speaking quietly with my mother in the kitchen the way sisters do when time has smoothed some of the old edges between them. I don't know exactly what changed her mind about coming. My mother told me later that she'd written a letter, not asking for approval, only saying that whatever happened with me, she hoped her sister would still consider herself my family. She hadn't expected an answer. She got one anyway, in the form of my aunt standing at our door that morning. I still visit the colony. Less than I once dreamed I might, but enough that my cousins there know me, and enough that the rhythms of that place don't feel foreign to me anymore, even if I'll never live by them fully. I still hum the hymns the way my mother taught me, in that slower, rounder cadence, even in a congregation that sings them differently. No one corrects me for it now. Or if they notice, they've decided it isn't worth mentioning. I used to believe that not being fully one thing meant being nothing at all, a kind of quiet failure sitting between two lives that had never quite made room for me. I don't believe that anymore. I think I was never missing a home. I think I was carrying two of them at once, and it took me most of my growing up to understand that this wasn't a flaw in me. It was simply a shape no one had thought to make room for before I came along. My mother says now, when she thinks no one is listening closely, that perhaps I was given exactly the childhood I needed, so that someone, somewhere, would finally understand what it means to belong to both worlds without ever being fully owned by either one. I think she's right.